Winston Churchill would be in prison today. So would Charles Dickens. And your great-grandmother should be facing serious jail time. I'm not talking about war crimes or scandals. I'm talking about their Tuesday mornings. The tea they drank, the jokes they told at dinner parties, the way they disciplined their kids, even the medicine they took for a headache. Here's what nobody tells you about history. We don't just judge the past differently, we've criminalized it. And I don't mean in some abstract philosophical way. I mean actual laws with actual prison sentences that would put our ancestors behind bars for behaviors that were so normal, so unremarkable, that nobody even thought twice about them. Today, we're going through 20 everyday British activities that were completely legal, completely ordinary, some of them even considered virtuous, that would now land you in court. And by the end, you're going to ask yourself a question that's deeply uncomfortable. If we were transported forward 100 years, how many of us would be criminals? Let's start with the one that'll make you spit out your morning coffee. Number 1. Putting cocaine in your children's toothache medicine. Before you react, pause. Because this wasn't some underground operation. This was Boots the chemist. This was your local pharmacy. Between the 1880s and 1916, you could walk into any respectable British drugstore and purchase cocaine lozenges, opium syrups, and heroin-based cough medicine designed specifically for children. The labels featured cheerful imagery. Mothers requested them by name. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, a bestseller across Britain, contained morphine. The recommended dose for teething infants? Repeat as necessary. And it was repeated, frequently, because it worked. A baby given morphine stops crying. A mother in 1890 didn't see herself as drugging her child. She saw herself as being a good parent, using modern medicine to relieve genuine suffering. Today, under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, giving cocaine to a child would result in up to 14 years in prison. The mother who thought she was helping would be classified alongside the worst kind of criminal. Should she be? Of course not. But that's the law. Which brings us to number 2, and this one's darker. Marital rape didn't become illegal in England and Wales until 1991. Let that sink in. 1991. People who are in their early 30s today were born into a Britain where a husband could not legally be prosecuted for raping his wife. The legal reasoning? Marriage constituted permanent consent. In the eyes of the law, a wife had no right to refuse her husband. This wasn't medieval England. This was the era of the Spice Girls, of Tony Blair, of the early internet. A man who forced himself on his wife in 1990 faced 0 legal consequences. Today, he'd face life imprisonment under the Sexual Offenses Act 2003. Should every husband who committed this act before 1991 be prosecuted now? That's a legal impossibility, but it's also a moral vortex. We're talking about millions of men, many of whom genuinely believed they were within their rights because the law told them they were. But here's where it gets psychologically twisted. Number 3. Hitting other people's children as a form of community discipline. In Britain, well into the 1980s, if you were misbehaving in public, say, throwing rocks at a neighbor's window or swearing at an elderly woman, any adult could physically discipline you. A slap across the back of the head, a grab by the ear, and then they'd march you home and tell your parents, who would often punish you again for embarrassing them. This was called taking responsibility for the community. It was seen as civic duty. Today, that's assault on a minor. Under the Children Act 2004, striking someone else's child could result in up to 5 years in prison. Parents have been prosecuted for less. In 2019, a Scottish man was charged after slapping a teenager who had thrown eggs at his car. The question isn't whether it's wrong. Most people today would say it is. The question is, should the hundreds of thousands of British adults who did this routinely be considered criminals? And we're just getting started. Number 4. Leaded petrol. Every single person in Britain who drove a car between 1920 and 2000 was participating in an activity that caused mass poisoning. Tetraethyl lead was added to petrol to prevent engine knocking, and it worked brilliantly. It also turned into breathable lead particles that blanketed every city, town, and village in Britain. Children growing up in the 1970s had lead levels in their blood that would be considered medical emergencies today. Studies now link this exposure to reduced IQ, increased aggression, and long-term cognitive damage. Entire generations were chemically altered. Was it illegal? No. Should it have been? Absolutely. Today, under environmental and public health laws, knowingly releasing lead into the atmosphere would result in severe criminal penalties, potentially decades in prison for corporate executives. But here's the twist. Nearly everyone knew it was harmful. By the 1960s, scientists were publishing studies. By the 1970s, the evidence was overwhelming. And yet Britain didn't fully ban leaded petrol until 2000, 20 years after the health consensus was clear. So who's responsible? The oil companies? The government officials who delayed action? The millions of drivers who filled up their tanks every week? Number 5 takes us into the home, and it's one that still makes older generations defensive. Smoking indoors with children present. Until 2007, you could smoke in a car with a baby in the back seat. You could smoke at the dinner table while your kids ate. You could smoke in the living room during family movie night. This wasn't just legal, it was ubiquitous. Photographs from the 1970s and 80s show parents holding infants in one arm and cigarettes in the other. Today, smoking in a car with anyone under 18 is illegal in England and Wales, punishable by a £50 fine. But the health consequences were far worse than anyone admitted at the time. Secondhand smoke causes asthma, respiratory infections, and increases the risk of sudden infant death syndrome. Should those parents be blamed? They were operating within the knowledge and norms of their time, but their children, now adults, carry the health impacts in their lungs. Let me give you number 6, and this one will genuinely shock you. Selling children. Not in the way you're imagining, but it happened. In the 18th and 19th centuries, impoverished British families sometimes sold their children into apprenticeships or domestic service. The transactions were legal, contracts were signed, money changed hands. The children, some as young as 7, were sent to work in factories, mines, or wealthy households. They had no choice. Their parents had legal authority to transfer them. Some were treated well, many were not. Under the Modern Slavery Act 2015, this would be classified as human trafficking, with a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. But here's the deeply uncomfortable part. Many of those parents weren't monsters. They were desperate. Starvation was real. They believed they were giving their children a chance at survival, even if it meant a brutal childhood. Should we judge them by today's laws, or by the impossible choices they faced? Number 7. Corporal punishment in schools. If you went to a British school before 1987, there's a good chance you were hit by a teacher. The cane, the slipper, the ruler across the knuckles. This wasn't abuse in the eyes of the law. It was discipline. Students were struck for talking out of turn, for failing to complete homework, for slouching. Some teachers kept detailed logs of the punishments they administered. Parents often supported it. A good caning never hurt anyone, they'd say. Today, under the Education Act 1996, any form of corporal punishment in schools is illegal. A teacher who caned a student now would face assault charges, lose their job, and likely end up on a registry preventing them from working with children. Should the thousands of teachers who routinely cane students face retroactive justice? Most people would say no, but the students who were beaten, some traumatized, might disagree. Number 8 escalates this even further. Child labor in chimney sweeping. Between the late 1700s and 1875, thousands of British children, some as young as 4, were forced to climb inside chimneys to clean them. They inhaled soot, suffered burns, developed lung disease, and sometimes became stuck and died. Their employers knew the risks. Society knew the risks. Charles Kingsley wrote The Water Babies in 1863 to expose the horror, and yet it continued for another 12 years. Today, forcing a child to perform such labor would violate the Children and Young Persons Act 1933, modern health and safety laws, and potentially constitute manslaughter if the child died. The employers would face decades in prison, but at the time, perfectly legal, even respectable. Here's number 9, and it's one most people don't realize was ever allowed. Drunk driving, without consequences. The first drink driving laws in Britain weren't introduced until 1967. Before that, you could down a bottle of whiskey, get behind the wheel, and as long as you didn't crash or drive recklessly in front of a police officer, there was no crime. People did this constantly. Pub culture revolved around it. You'd have a few pints, drive home, and nobody thought twice. The number of alcohol-related road deaths was staggering, but it wasn't classified as a specific offense. Today, driving under the influence can result in up to 6 months in prison for a first offense, and up to 14 years if you kill someone. Every single person who drove drunk before 1967 would be a criminal under current law. Should they be? They were following, or rather, not breaking, the law of their time. But their victims are still dead. Number 10. Hate speech that was considered normal humor. British television in the 1970s and 80s featured jokes that would result in criminal prosecution today. Racist caricatures, homophobic slurs, jokes about sexual assault. These weren't fringe comedians. These were prime-time BBC shows, watched by millions. Love Thy Neighbor, a sitcom that ran from 1972 to 1976, was built entirely around racist insults between neighbors. It Ain't Half Hot Mum featured white actors in brownface. These shows won awards. They were considered family entertainment. Today, under the Public Order Act 1986 and the Communications Act 2003, making such statements publicly, especially online, can result in fines or imprisonment. In 2021, a man was jailed for posting racist messages on social media. Should the writers, actors, and producers of those shows be prosecuted now? They were operating within the legal and cultural norms of their era. But the harm they caused, the normalization of bigotry, the trauma inflicted on minority communities, was real. Number 11 takes us into the publishing world. Libel laws were so weak that newspapers could destroy people's lives with impunity. Before the Defamation Act 2013, British tabloids regularly printed false, career-ending accusations with minimal consequences. The burden of proof was on the victim, and libel cases were prohibitively expensive. Innocent people were branded as criminals, perverts, or traitors on front pages. By the time retractions were printed, if they ever were, the damage was permanent. Today's libel laws offer far greater protection, and journalists who knowingly publish falsehoods can face significant penalties. But what about the editors who ruined lives in the 1980s and 90s? Should they face justice now? Number 12 is about speech, but in a different context. Swearing in public was technically illegal, but rarely enforced, unless you were working class. The Town Police Clauses Act 1847 made it an offense to use profane or obscene language in public. But enforcement was wildly inconsistent. A wealthy gentleman swearing in a pub? Ignored. A working-class woman swearing in the street? Arrested. This created a two-tier system where the law existed on paper, but was weaponized based on class and social status. Today, while public order offenses still exist, the enforcement is more regulated, but the old law technically remains on the books. The question is, how many working-class Britons were unjustly punished for behavior the wealthy engaged in freely? Number 13. Thalidomide was prescribed to pregnant women as a safe sedative. Between 1958 and 1962, British doctors prescribed thalidomide to thousands of pregnant women for morning sickness. The drug was marketed as completely safe. It wasn't. It caused catastrophic birth defects, children born without limbs, with damaged internal organs, with severe disabilities. Knew about problems in animal trials, but sold it anyway. Doctors prescribed it in good faith, trusting the pharmaceutical industry. Today, this would result in criminal charges under modern drug safety regulations, potential manslaughter charges, and massive corporate penalties. But at the time, the company paid compensation, but no one went to prison. Should they have? Absolutely. The victims certainly think so. Number 14. Asbestos was everywhere, and everyone knew it was deadly. British schools, hospitals, homes, and offices were built with asbestos throughout the 20th century. Workers who installed it developed mesothelioma and lung cancer at horrifying rates. The industry knew, the government knew, and yet it wasn't fully banned until 1999. Today, knowingly exposing workers to asbestos would result in severe criminal penalties under the Health and Safety at Work Act, 1974, and corporate manslaughter charges. But the executives who made those decisions in the 1970s and 80s, most faced no consequences. Number 15 brings us to mental health treatment. Institutionalizing people for being gay, unmarried and pregnant, or simply difficult. Well into the 1970s, British asylums housed people who weren't mentally ill. They were just socially inconvenient. Women who had children out of wedlock, gay men, people with learning disabilities who could have lived independently, with minimal support. They were locked away, sometimes for life. Many were subjected to electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and chemical restraints. Today, this would constitute false imprisonment, assault, and human rights violations under the Mental Capacity Act, 2005, and the Human Rights Act, 1998. The doctors, families, and officials who facilitated this, they were following the law, but the people whose lives were destroyed, they'd call it torture. Number 16. Paying women significantly less than men for identical work was legal until 1970. Before the Equal Pay Act 1970, British employers could and did pay women half what they paid men for the same job. This wasn't hidden, it was explicit. Job advertisements listed separate male and female wage rates. A female teacher earned less than a male teacher. A female factory worker earned less than a male factory worker. This was considered natural, even necessary, based on the assumption that men were breadwinners and women were supplementary earners. Today, this violates the Equality Act 2010, and companies can face significant fines and legal action. But what about the millions of women who were systematically underpaid? They lost decades of earnings, pensions, and economic security. Should the companies and managers who enforce this be held accountable now? Number 17. Child labor was widespread and brutal. Before the factory acts of the 19th century, British children worked 12 to 16-hour days in mines, factories, and mills. They lost fingers in machinery. They developed spinal deformities from crawling through mine shafts. Some died. This was legal. This was the economy. Today, employing children under 13 is illegal under the Children and Young Persons Act 1933, and violating child labor laws can result in prosecution. But the factory owners who built fortunes on child suffering, many became peers of the realm. Number 18. Workhouses imprison the poor for being poor. Under the Poor Law Amendment Act, 1834, destitute Britons could be forced into workhouses, institutions that separated families, imposed harsh labor, and offered starvation-level rations. You could be locked in a workhouse simply for being unemployed or elderly without family support. Conditions were deliberately brutal to deter people from seeking help. Today, this would violate human rights law, constitute false imprisonment, and potentially meet the definition of torture under international law. But the officials who ran these institutions, they were doing their jobs. Number 19. Dumping industrial waste directly into rivers was standard practice. British factories routinely discharged toxic chemicals, heavy metals, and untreated sewage into rivers throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The Thames was biologically dead by the 1950s. Fish populations collapsed. Communities downstream suffered health crises. This wasn't illegal. It was how industry operated. Today, under the Environmental Protection Act 1990 and the Water Resources Act 1991, such pollution would result in massive fines and potential imprisonment for company directors. But the industrialists who poisoned Britain's waterways, they were celebrated as job creators. Number 20 brings us full circle. Doctors could refuse treatment based on race, sexuality, or marital status. Until relatively recently, British doctors had significant discretion to refuse patients. A GP could turn away someone because they were black, because they were gay, because they were an unmarried pregnant woman. This wasn't just individual prejudice, it was institutionally accepted. Today, this would violate the Equality Act 2010, and medical professionals could be struck off and prosecuted. But the doctors who did this, many practiced until retirement with spotless records. So here we are, 20 everyday activities that were normal, legal, and in some cases encouraged, that would now result in criminal prosecution. Winston Churchill, who we mentioned at the start, would indeed face issues today, not for his wartime decisions, but for things like his casual racism in public speeches, his support for using chemical weapons on uncivilized tribes, and his views on eugenics, all of which were mainstream at his time. Charles Dickens advocated for harsh punishment of the poor and supported the brutal suppression of the Indian Rebellion of 1857. He'd be cancelled at minimum. Your great-grandmother? If she smoked around her kids, gave them opium-laced medicine, and supported corporal punishment in schools, she'd be looking at multiple offenses under current law. But here's the question that should haunt us. What are we doing right now that our great-grandchildren will find criminal? Is it eating meat, knowing the environmental and ethical costs? Is it using smartphones made with child-mind cobalt? Is it participating in an economic system that exploits the global south? Which future generations might classify as reckless endangerment? The uncomfortable truth is that legality and morality are not the same thing. They never have been. Every single person in this video was acting legally in their time. Many believe they were acting morally too. So should they be jailed? No. You can't prosecute people retroactively for following the laws of their era. That way lies chaos. But should we judge them? Should we learn from them? Absolutely. Because if we don't, we're doomed to become the criminals of the future, and our descendants won't be nearly as forgiving as we're being right now. The laws will change. They always do. The question is, will you be on the right side of history when they do? Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments which of these shocked you most, and what you think we're doing now that future generations will condemn.